Leading Ideas Talks podcast is brought to you by the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Subscribe free to our weekly e-newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/Leading Ideas. Leading Ideas Talks is also brought to you by Adult Christian Study Curriculum from the Lewis Center. Bring the best of contemporary Christian scholarship to your congregation's in-person and online small groups and classes. Our video-based curriculum encourages energetic discussion and personal reflection on a number of subjects. Studies include Journey Through the Psalms, Simply Christian, Religion and Science, Nature, Our First Way of Knowing God, and many more. Learn more and watch sample videos at churchleadership.com/studies. And remember to stay up to date with the latest church leadership strategies and information. Please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos. The pandemic taught us that church happens in powerful and meaningful ways outside our buildings. In this episode, Dave Barnhart describes how small, home-centered worshiping communities can connect with people who may never cross the threshold of your church.
I'm Ann Michael. I'm one of the editors of Leading Ideas e-newsletter, and I'm the host for this episode of Leading Ideas Talks. I'm speaking today with Dave Barnhart, who's pastor of St. Junia, which is a network of house churches in Birmingham, Alabama. And he's also the author of a book, Church Comes Home, Start a House Church Network Anywhere. And I'm so excited to be speaking with him today about the potential of the house church movement and perhaps also what those of us who are in what he calls legacy churches can learn from the experience of house churches. So welcome, Dave. It's so good to have you with us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So to begin, I wondered if you could just very briefly share a bit of your story of how you got involved as a planter and leader of house churches.
Sure. Well, I have had an idea that I wanted to start a church for a long time, especially my own affinity group are people who've been hurt or burned by church or who don't feel like they fit in church. We live in Alabama, which is one of the most churched places around, but it also means that people who aren't, who may be seeking or maybe unchurched feel very isolated and also very marginalized by the Christian fundamentalist culture that we live in. And so I, in 2012, started church planting. I went to some church planting trainings and various kinds of boot camps through the Methodist Church. And we started a church in 2012 that was really more of a conventional church. We had a band, we had a venue, and that sort of thing. But what we found was that a lot of people, we'd have these sort of two reactions. People would either come and say, hey, this is great, but then they wouldn't come back. Or they would tell me, hey, I love what you're doing. I love your theology. I love the way you're trying to reach people who don't feel like they fit. I'm never going to church again, but I love what you're doing. So I struggled with how do we create sticking power. And we found that really the place we got most traction was in our small groups that we were running at the time. And so we sort of pivoted in 2016 to doing house churches, to really focusing on that smaller intentional group. That's kind of where it blossomed. We've had a lot of success. At one point we had 6 house churches, and I think at the most, we had about half the people who were attending the church hadn't been to church in 6 months. So I felt like we were really getting some good traction there. But the process of learning about house church, we had to sort of adapt some of what was already out there. House church has been going on for a long time, since the beginning, really. What we started doing was something that was a little more intentionally liturgical. So we have a liturgy. We read scripture responsively. We have some guided prayer time, and then we have conversation. And it's really the conversation where I think a lot of the discipleship happens. So instead of me standing up and talking to people, they're bringing their own perspectives, since that's where people really we're seeing most growth. Most spiritual growth, most discipleship. And started doing that in 2016. and have been doing it ever since. Of course, COVID has kind of thrown a wrench into things, but we've been meeting online and occasionally meeting in smaller groups as well. So.
Mm-hmm. So, for the sake of our listeners, could you define house church and how you see house churches as distinct from other religious gatherings that might happen either in people's homes or in non-institutional settings?
Yeah, well, I think one of the biggest confusions oftentimes is people think of house churches as small groups, and they do have a lot in common. But the idea is this is the worshiping community, like getting together. Sometimes we sing. I'll admit music is not great typically in a house church unless you've got some very talented people. But the focus really is this is our worshiping community. And we have the way we do it is we have a liturgy. Oftentimes we use common prayer, which is by Shane Claiborne and Enuma Okoro and Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. But we've started using recently Wilda Gaffney's a women's lectionary for the whole church and creating a liturgy out of that. So we have scripture readings, kind of call and response. When we meet, we do communion. And it's really focused more on this is the worship experience. This isn't in addition to something else. So I would say that's one of the biggest differences. There's certainly lots of other ways that discipleship happens in homes, small groups, book studies, variety of things. And we do some of those things. We do book studies and service projects. But what really sets house churches apart is this is the primary worshiping community. And it's, usually a dozen to 20 people at the most. So it's intentionally small. Anyway, that's kind of that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're serving a network you have planted a network of house churches. Can you kind of describe those communities and how they connect to one another?
Sure. Well, again, I have to put an asterisk beside this because things have been different for the last 2 years because of COVID. At our peak, we were doing 6 house churches, which I'll be honest is a little too much for one person. 4 house churches is about ideal. But they would meet at different times. Some meet Wednesdays, Wednesday nights. That was a group largely of people who worked on Sundays and couldn't go to a Sunday church. We'd have groups that met in Birmingham and in Huntsville. So occasionally I would go back and forth between Huntsville and Birmingham to be with those different churches. And they could meet, we would often have one in the morning and one in the afternoon. So I would typically drive around, but I also had some people who were sort of lay pastors who helped lead other house churches. And those would be the people I work very closely with because I'm essentially training them to do what I'm doing. And that enabled me to reach people I wouldn't otherwise normally reach. So we had one house church we have one house church that's led by a Black man who does a lot of work in HIV prevention. And so he had access to people I would never reach. And I really felt like that is one of the powerful things about house churches. I have an intern working with me right now who's a woman who's reaching people who have been hurt by church and really wouldn't trust a man as their pastor. And I feel like that is a way that we can overcome some of the church hurt that keeps people from accessing church and from hearing the good news.
Yeah, so what you were just sharing, that really leads me to my next question, because I think your book does cast a very inspiring vision of how house churches can have the potential to reach people that other churches aren't able to reach. But at the same time, something I really appreciated about your book was that it was really very balanced and realistic in assessing both the strengths and the weaknesses of house churches. And so, and in fact, there's one point in the book where you actually list some of the pros and cons of house churches. So yeah. I thought that might be interesting for our listeners to know as well. What do you see as some of the strengths of house churches, but what are some of the limitations?
Well, definitely, I think the strength is its versatility. I mean, I feel like house churches really get that sense of, Jesus throws seed, and wherever the seed lands, a house church can grow. I mean, it really is this I think, very distributed model of how we reach a wide variety of people. Like I said, there's people as a white straight guy that I'm not going to reach, and just because I'm automatically a suspect, with good reason. And there are other things that are great about having a distributed network, because if something happens to me, these other house churches are going to keep meeting. Like I don't have to be present for them. And it's such a simple model that it's easily reproducible.
Right.
I think that's, and especially as I think about the future, things like COVID, things like, and climate change, other crises, global crises that we may face. I just feel like house churches are going to be very resilient because they're not dependent upon a top-heavy structure. There are things that house churches can't do. I mean, the things like legacy churches are going to do better just because there's economies of scale. They're going to be able to have more programs, especially for children and young people. They're going to have a little more leverage to do things like buy medical debt for folks or whatever, large programs that they do. I think though that part of it is just recognizing that there's people, especially in the world we live in now, where there's such distrust of institutions. And distrust of institutions across the range. I mean, whether people are political, whether they're conservative or liberal, whether we're talking political institutions or faith institutions, people are just very suspicious right now, most I've ever seen. And to be able to still reach people who have questions about, who are you really representing? What's your real angle? I think that's one of the things that house churches help do. Come have dinner. Let's see, let's have a conversation. That's where the genuine human connection happens. That's where discipleship happens, I think.
So your book was written really, I think, just before the onset of COVID and the tremendous surge of interest in virtual ministry. And, as I'm reading about hybrid and virtual ministry, the subject of, meeting in people's homes as a companion to virtual ministry comes up repeatedly. And so I guess, given your definition and experience of house church, how are you seeing that evolve now in a time when virtual ministry has become more popular?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would think our style fit really well with doing virtual ministry, because music wasn't one of our big strengths anyway. Conversation really is our strength. Webinars work really well for that style of participatory preaching, I should say. I usually talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then most of the rest of it is conversation. And I have worship leaders, which typically are the leaders of other house churches, who are sort of my webinar conversation partners. And then we take comments from Facebook and YouTube and the Zoom chat. And it has worked really well. I would say it's been a little difficult, because the thing is, if people are reluctant to go to church for health reasons, then they're also not likely to want people in their homes for health reasons. So that there hasn't been a lot of ability to sync up those things. But what we have started doing is we've been doing a lot of meeting outside, and that's more of a social thing, more of getting together for, meals, conversation, and that sort of thing. Whereas, worship happens online in this sort of conversational format.
Do you imagine going forward that there might be house churches that exist solely in virtual space? I mean, do you see that as an extension of the movement?
I think that I certainly can see that as a possibility. It wouldn't work for my folks as well, I think. Although I don't know, I just said that, but then I question it, because we do have a lot of folks. One thing people aren't aware of is how many people out there have social anxiety and other things that prevent them from to large gatherings. And if you're working with people who have some kind of disability or significant anxiety, who don't want to leave their home, then online is great. I do think, we feel a loss in that. Part of the strength of house churches is that intimate connection. And so there's a loss of that. But I do think I do think there are people more than we often realize who just have a real hard time getting out of the house.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like, too, from the way you've described your churches, some of them have kind of a niche character of bringing together people of a certain affinity. And in a virtual space, you may have the ability to gather people maybe who aren't neighbors necessarily, who share that affinity.
That's definitely the case. Yeah, this is that's one thing I talk about in the book. This is a very niche. Like if you're after the people who aren't going to come to church, right? You're after a niche, and and recognizing how hard it is. I've all the church planting conferences I've gone to, all the training I went to, has a very triumphalistic idea about gathering people or reaching the unchurched. And most of the time it's like, get them to come to our thing. And I feel like that's not going to reach the people who aren't already willing to come to your thing.
Right. Yeah. So go to rather than come here.
Absolutely.
One of the things that struck me during COVID, especially in the early months of the lockdown, was that there really was renewed attention to how people practice faith at home. And what first motivated me to pick up your book was, I think that experience of the COVID lockdown really revealed to a lot of us that particularly mainline Protestants haven't really been equipped to live their lives of faith at home in terms of personal devotions or fostering faith within their homes or within their families. And so I wondered if there are any lessons from your work with house churches for those of us who are part of what you call legacy churches, but are nonetheless interested in practicing faith more intentionally at home or in small gatherings.
Yeah. So one of the first things that comes to mind is we have had a tradition of doing an Epiphany house blessing, which is something it's a tradition from I began in the Church of England, I think, or I'm not sure where it actually began. But the idea is you chalk a blessing over your door, and there's a little recitation that you do. It's great to do with kids, especially if you can pick a kid up and hold them and let them chalk over the door. And so there's stuff you can do like that I think is ritual that's personally meaningful, and that really you can do at home. I mean, so I know this may sound a little scandalous, but when I think about the people who are interested in kind of DIY religion, people interested in New Age practices, that kind of stuff, so much of it is, this is something you can do at home. Like, here's something you can, right. And even if, regardless of whether as you agree with that or not, if it fits with your theology, the point is they're doing something at home, right? And so often what we do in legacy mainline denominations is, come here, this is where religion happens at our location. And giving people the tools to do ritual at home, connect them to something bigger than themselves. I think that's so important. Yeah.
So one of the things that I found most inspiring about your book was that it has a vision for a different leadership dynamic, really. And you wrote, when a pastor sits among many in a circle instead of standing in front and preaching to an audience, the dynamic changes. And I'm a layperson, and I'm pretty passionate about the idea of a more inclusive paradigm of ministry. So I wondered if you could comment on the leadership dimension of house churches and sort of what the leadership development practices are that you're cultivating.
Yeah. So we really look at my discipleship model is really based on covenant discipleship groups, which have this beautiful holistic idea of worship, devotion, compassion, and justice. And we added witness to that, so that there's 5 areas of discipleship. And part of the idea is that we're always engaging each of those areas, both as individuals and then as a community. So individual is devotion, individual mercy, but also corporate worship, corporate justice, and then witness binds all that together. So thinking about each of those areas of Christian leadership and teaching them to people, like, this is why we do justice. This is why we do devotion. And that really is something that the whole community possesses. So to kind of make that a lived experience, the sage on the stage model of preaching just doesn't work very well, right? That has to be a kind of, how are we living as community? And I do feel like house churches are closer to things like intentional community. I mean, you hear words like the new monasticism and that kind of stuff, which I resonate with. And I think there's a craving for what does this mean in my lived experience among my friends and my neighbors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it sounded like you are working to really mentor others to lead churches themselves. What is that like?
Yeah, so typically, well, it's interesting because the way that it's happened for me is I've just sort of bumped into people who tell me they resonate with house churches. And occasionally I'll make an appeal. Hey, if you want to talk about starting a house church, and someone will come to me and say, I really think I'm ready to do this, or I've been thinking about this for a while, praying about this, and I feel like I have an ability to reach my friends who don't go to church, right? Who oftentimes express a longing, like they've told me what they miss, but that they're not going back for whatever reason. And so I want to create a community for them. And I think God just provides those people. Like here's someone who has connections to someone I'm never going to have a connection to. And I think that's, I work with that person to say, this is how we do it. And it's an easily replicable model that can adapt to whatever their context is, whatever their cultural background is.
So something else that intrigued me in your book was that you seem to really have in your mind the paradigm of innovation and change, and you use some of the language of church innovation when you talk about the idea of one of the advantages of planning house churches is that they can fail fast, or you talk about the idea of starting a group that has a trial period, and you even talk about the house church movement as a disruptor, in the ecology of the broader church ecosystem. And so I wondered if you could speak to that. I mean, how you see house churches being an instrument of change and innovation.
Yeah. Well, I do think, again, like you said, that rapid deployment, you can start a house church. It doesn't take $250,000 and 4 years of training to get it started. And you can launch it. And if it succeeds, great. If not, you don't worry about it. This is like part of it's having a more Buddhist mindset about letting things go, right? If things happen, if they don't work the way you had in your mind, it's okay. You reached some people, right? You had those life-changing, valuable conversations. And I think that's really a ministry approach that the broader church needs, because we have such a corporate business mindset of anything we do has to succeed and has to be, quote, self-sustaining, even the very act of church planting, right? So like the whole act of church planting, the metric for success is you plant, and then in a certain number of years, you are then self-sustaining. Honestly, that's just not going to happen with house churches. I'm aspiring now to be bivocational so that I can start more house churches, so that my income isn't dependent on this process. And the fact is, most churches aren't, quote, self-sustaining. Right. They're getting resources from other places, and honestly, the reason that they've grown in the way that they have, the reason we have mega churches and the reason we have very large churches is because it's more economic than spiritual. It's because of the way that we extract resources and put them into business. So.
Mm-hmm. Or there are churches that are being sustained through their legacy, either the value of their property, their buildings, their endowments, and if they had to sustain themselves based on their current revenue and expenses, they couldn't do it.
Absolutely.
That only goes so far.
Absolutely.
I'm curious. since you've written on this subject, you must have a sense of, beyond your work in Alabama. Is there a way of knowing how big this house church phenomena is, either within the U.S. or worldwide?
It's so impossible to measure, because you have places like China where house churches are the dominant form of church. There have been people in the non-denominational world who've been doing house churches for ages. Frank Viola is one of the big names
Right.
From the 80s and 90s who's been planting house churches forever. And typically the way especially I'm Methodist, so our denominational structure is very interested in metrics. How do you measure all these different things? And house churches are so fluid, and they're so hard to count. Some of the research that Frank Viola did said that the average lifespan of a house church is between 6 months and 2 years, I think. So you're not talking about something that's going to be around for 100 years, that you can look at and point to and say that membership is X number. It's much more amorphous. There are estimates that there are more people in house churches than are going to legacy churches worldwide, especially. And I don't know how you could ever measure that. And then you get in that fuzzy area, like, well, what are you considering a church? Do they have to take up an offering? Do they have to do sacraments? What is it that counts as church? And then suddenly you're in a whole messy theological question.
No, it does raise questions about what your ecclesial definitions are. I mean, when you said that, sustainability means you can pay a pastor and have a building. I mean, I think that is the de facto definition of church in our denomination, whether we want to admit it or not. And so,
right.
I can see how it gets into that. To begin to draw things to a close, I wanted to ask you the question, you call standing churches legacy churches. I have a hard time putting that out of my mouth, because in other circles, legacy churches are those that are making a decision intentionally to die. So
Ouch.
But your language is to call those churches legacy churches, so I'll use that. So what are some of the key lessons that legacy churches can take away from what you've learned about house churches?
I think one of the big things, and this, so I spent a good portion of my ministry in some more traditional, quote, traditional / legacy / institutional churches. One that had a membership of about 3,000, one that was a small country church. And I think one of the important things is this idea of programming. Programming is just, it's in fact, I don't even like the word anymore. I think so much of ministry needs to be more relational, and to not hang on to things that really ought to die. Oftentimes we keep something going because we don't want to hurt someone's ego, instead of saying, look, this thing was good, it served its purpose, now let's move on to something else. And to have more of a future orientation than idea that, I've invested in X and I need to keep it going. I think that's one of the main things. The other thing is, I think I'll say, just for me, it's the perception of a church ecosystem. One of the things I talk about in the book is we use this phrase, the institutional church, and I just think it's not, it doesn't describe the actual institution, which includes publishers, consultants, academia. We're just thinking about the denominational structures. That's just one little piece of the full church ecosystem. And for me, I want to include those things that don't get captured, the intentional communities of people who don't go to church, but who have a religious orientation in their lives. And I call them the mystics and monastics, the people who gather in formal communities. All that is part of an ecosystem instead of a, quote, institution. And I think those are important aspects of church life that often get pushed to the side or get ignored.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for this conversation, Dave. This is such an interesting subject. I learned so much from reading your book. In fact, the first time I read it, I was ready to go start my own house church. I was so excited about it. So I really do think that there is something here that gets at the essence of what our calling is as Christians, and our calling to reach people that otherwise might not be reached by our ministry. So I want to thank you for adding this to our dialogue. And thanks for the wonderful conversation today.
I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for Leading Ideas Talks. Please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos.